Assad in conversation with Sandow. One reminder for those of you who enjoy this kind of event, Assad also generously leads our Islamic texts circle each semester, and we're meeting this week on Friday. So without further ado, I give you Sandow.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me. Strangely, I've had a 25-year career of showing work here in San Francisco and have art in all major collections around the Bay Area, and I've never been to Berkeley. I think I only walked across campus only once before today, so it's nice to be here. Thank you for bringing me, and thank you for everyone who comes to see this. And it's a small enough group. Feel free to shout out questions in the middle of anything, because I'm not a really professional speaker. I'm going to distract you from my speaking skills by showing you a ton of pictures and showing them really quickly. And basically what I'm going to do is talk about this project I did called American Qur'an, and basically why I did it, and how I came to think of doing it, why I did it, how I did it, and then show you some of the result of it. It is a finished project. Actually, it's not my most recent project. I finished it about 3 years ago, and it is an illuminated manuscript of the entire text of the Quran in English. And it took me 9 years to do, from start to finish. And it was published in full and in 100% scale size by W.W. Norton, and it came out about 2 years ago, and it's available wherever books are sold. But to back up, I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles, and when I was a kid, I started surfing when I was 11 years old, and it has a lot to do with what you're going to see through the rest of the talk. But I grew up riding my bike to the beach to go surfing, and I still surf as much as I can, 4 or 5 times a week when I can. And we live in Long Beach now. I used to live in Hollywood. But surfing has had a lot to do with the decisions I've made about where I will travel, where I will live, where I went to college, things like that. I went to the Otis Art Institute in the 80s when it was in downtown Los Angeles at MacArthur Park in this building. I did, like I said, I started surfing when I was a kid. Surfing was the most important thing to me all through high school. I started going to college. I didn't really like high school. I didn't really like college. So after 2 years of college, I dropped out with a friend of mine. We took this old Jeep that I had, and we decided to drive to Rio de Janeiro to see Carnival. And we set out in this Jeep, and we traveled all through South America until the Jeep exploded, and then we took the bus. And 8 months later, we arrived in Rio de Janeiro, where I got a job in a surfboard factory and lived in Brazil for 4 years. Eventually, I went to college in Paris for a semester. I did a semester in England, looking at all the fantastic French paintings in the Louvre and the Tate Gallery. Made it back to Los Angeles, finished my BFA degree here at the Otis Art Institute, and got a studio in central LA, and decided now I'm an artist. This would have been late 80s, early 90s, and the first thing I started doing was these paintings about surfing, because it was the thing that I knew most about, and I was trying to find some voice or something, or some way to paint about something that I knew, that I loved. And so I started doing these big, gigantic paintings about surfing that were based on the paintings I had seen in the Louvre. So this is based on the Raft of the Medusa. And
how big was that then?
About 8 by 10 feet. I wanted them to be big, like in the Louvre, and since I was a beginning painter and no one was looking at them anyway, I just made them as big as I could. So they were like the size of a garage door. So this is a painting, another one based on a painting called Watson and the Shark, that's in the National Gallery in DC, I believe. But I started this way of working where I would look at art history that I had seen when I was doing my studies in Europe, and reimagining them and thinking about how can I make artworks that draw on the history of art but talk about life in our world today. So this is my version of the Death of Marat. about a drive-by shooting in my neighborhood in LA, and more paintings about drive-by shootings. But from this very beginning, when I got out of college, it became this way that I work, where I look back at art history for inspiration on how to do new works. This was a series of paintings I did about the riots in 1992. This is based on a painting, The Battle of Bunker Hill from the American Revolution. And this is another painting of mine from the LA riots, where the Crips and the Bloods are getting together and making a truce during the 4 days of the riots, which was an event that actually happened, but it was an imaginary painting of what that scene might look like. So I started doing this sort of work based on art history and jumped ahead, but I tend now to do these projects where I get a little bit of an idea and it becomes a big idea and it sort of grows and grows over years. And I ended up doing a whole series of paintings about imaginary war between Los Angeles and San Francisco that became a big project, and it was shown in a gallery in LA and San Francisco simultaneously. So to see the whole show, you had to drive between the cities and see them. And the whole series of works. But jumping up ahead in 2006, 2007, I had a reputation enough that I was invited by this place called the Hui Noeau Visual Arts Center, which was in Maui in Hawaii. And it's a small art school in Maui, but what they do is they invite artists to come in from all over the world, and you do a project with them, and then they do prints, and then they sell the prints, and the prints help keep this art school going. So the printer, Paul Maloney, invited me over, and he said, come over to Hawaii for 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll put you up, and we'll do a project in the print shop. And I said, I don't know anything about printmaking, I never studied in school or anything. And he said, it doesn't matter, that's even better, just come over and we'll see what happens. So my wife Elisa and I, we went to Maui, and like I always do, I started flipping through his library about the history of printmaking. I ended up stumbling on this series of prints by a Belgian artist named Jacques Callot, which were done in the 1600s. And there were these tiny little prints about the 30 Years' War in Europe. And it was a series of 18 little prints that were about the size of a dollar bill. And they told the story of the 30 Years' War from the beginning to sort of this triumphal invasion, to then the whole war starts to fall apart and there's looting and burning, and then the final scene is the troops coming home with like missing limbs. And it was interesting to me because I studied art history and I had never heard of these prints. They also were the inspiration for Goya's anti-war prints in the 1800s, 200 years later. And they're often considered to be some of the first early anti-war art that were done. You know, in the 1600s, the only patrons for arts were the kings or the church. So here was this suddenly a series of artworks about how horrible warfare was rather than how gory it was. So it was interesting. These were from the 1600s, then the Goyas were the 1800s, and here it was 2000s. And in America, we were invading Iraq and Afghanistan, which I was quite upset about. George Bush #2 was in office at the time. I was constantly following the news of the war in Iraq. But we ended up doing a series of 15 huge prints that were the size of a sheet of plywood. Elisa and I carved them and the printers printed them. It took a year and a half, and they told the story of the war in Iraq from the American invasion, well, from 9/11 bombings to the American invasion, and then to an imagined end, because at the time we did this project, the war was still going on. So this is our print of the battle for Fallujah, and the Americans rounding up people. And so it took us a year and a half. Elisa and I would go to Hawaii and carve 3 wood blocks. It would take about 3 weeks, and then we would go home for a few months while they printed them. And then when they were done, we'd fly back and do 3 more. So after like 5 visits, we had done 15. And in the meantime, I also did a whole series of paintings about the wars in Iraq and Abu Ghraib. But really following the news of the war in Iraq, I was upset about it from the get-go. I was following the invasions and everything that was going on and the arguments, listening to it on the radio every day. Abu Ghraib. This is one of the final ones, the execution of Saddam Hussein, based on a really blurry cell phone footage that was leaked right the day after it happened. And these are the paintings I was doing. This is my ironic view of the liberation of Baghdad, not depicting what actually happened, but depicting what Donald Rumsfeld told us was going to happen, that we would liberate Iraq and they would be happy to be liberated and come running out with flowers and candies, and obviously that didn't happen. And down here you see two dogs fighting, sort of to symbolize the way that was just going to carry on and carry on. So this is my painting of American troops in Saddam's palace in the Green Zone, based on I was looking at a lot of the Orientalist paintings, the French paintings from the 1800s, and sort of spoofing those, switching the roles of the women and the men. This is called The President's Dream, George Bush's dream of bringing liberty to Baghdad and flying on a magic carpet over the city in the war. And my studio is in the city, and around the corner from where I work, there's an army recruiting station, and we walk past it all the time, and we see young people in there, and especially when the war was going on, these wars, I'd see high school kids in there talking about signing up for the army, and I just think, what are they thinking, you know? They're going to get immediately sent off to these places. So this is my painting called The Soldier's Dream, maybe like a 16-year-old's fantasy of what's going to happen. He's going to go to some exotic country and meet beautiful women and see camels or something, all sort of spoofing the realities. And then as the war dragged on and dragged on, this is my painting called The Riddle of the Sphinx, and it, you know, after 10 years of war in Afghanistan, it wasn't really an argument going on among Americans of whether you're for the war or against your war. After so long, it was just a question for everyone, was like, how do we get out of this problem? And so this is sort of the eternal riddle of colonizers in the Middle East that can't extract themselves from the conundrums that they've waded into not understanding. Another one, The Riddle of the Sphinx, with a typical American soldier listening to a statue of Saddam whispering something that Americans aren't grasping about the complexities of the Middle East. So, this project took a year and a half or 2 years. Like I said, constantly paying attention to the news and following all the developments in the Middle East, and really just listening to the constant argument of Americans on the radio and in the press about, you know, what is Islam? Is Islam fundamentally at odds with American culture? Is this a war between the East and the West? Is this things that can never mesh? Is Islam a violent religion? This kind of debate was just going on all the time, and as I was listening to it, this is my painting of an American soldier returning, based on the Norman Rockwell painting of a soldier returning after World War II to Brooklyn. But I imagine it as an American soldier returning to the housing projects in South LA, and you know, to a much different reception, not the glorious, happy homecoming that you see in Norman Rockwell's world. But just listening to this constant American cultural discussion of what is Islam and all of it. So I'm just thinking, and at some point during this year and a half, I just sort of I said, wait a second, I'm so tired of listening to people on the radio tell me what Islam is. I said, wait a second, you know, I've been a surfer my whole life, I travel all the time to go surfing, and I started counting up the times I had been in Islamic parts of the world on my own personal travels. And I think I started counting 10 trips of extended, you know, a month each to different parts of the world. And so For example, this is a mosque in Java, where I've been to Indonesia maybe 6 or 7 times to go surfing. This is surfing in Java. This is a mosque in the southern Philippines. My wife is half Filipino. We went there to visit her family. This is me surfing in the Philippines. This is Tangier. This is me surfing in Morocco, where I've been several times with my wife. This is me and a friend standing in front of the largest mosque in Africa, in Casablanca. So I had been going to these places for half of my life, spending long parts of the time there, meeting fantastic people, eating amazing food, going into mosques, just traveling, just, being interested. And I started thinking, I've been in these places. I'm listening to how it's being spoken about in the United States, and it's nothing like my personal experience of what it's like to be in these parts of the world. And so at one point I just said, I'm sick of listening to people tell me what Islam is. I'm going to see for myself. And I went down to the local bookstore and I bought a copy of the Qur'an and just started reading it. I started reading it in English translation, obviously. I got several, as many as I could at Barnes & Noble, maybe 5 or 6 different English versions, and I started reading them and comparing them. I started reading about the Qur'an, historical things, and looking at Qur'ans. I got all these coffee table books about, the Qur'an as an object and these beautiful historical Qur'ans, and was so amazed at how beautiful they were and how intricate they were as an artist. They were fascinating to me. And gradually I started thinking, wow, maybe I could make like an illuminated manuscript of the Qur'an. And then I thought, well, that's a crazy idea. That's like, nobody does that anymore. It's just too much work, But it kind of always was in the back of my head of something that I was interested in. And then one day I was on yet another surfing trip to Ireland with a couple of friends, and we found ourselves wandering around Dublin on a rainy afternoon. And I had never heard of this place before, but we went past the Chester Beatty Library, and I went inside, and they claim, I think, that they have the second largest collection of Qur'ans in the world, outside of Egypt, I think. So I went in, and suddenly, instead of these coffee table books of reproductions of Qur'ans that I was looking at, there was 1,000 years of Qur'ans, like in all these cases that I could see for real, right in front of me. And where I had been looking at them like this in reproduction, I would look at them and I think, these are so amazing and so precise and so perfect that there's no way I could do any sort of artwork that is up to the level of that craftsmanship. And then when I finally saw them in real life, you see they're not as perfect as they are in reproduction. They're more beautiful, they're handmade. You can see parts where they have erased a mistake and fixed something, or the colors go outside of the line, and suddenly they didn't seem to be this so perfect, unattainable perfection, but they seem to be real handmade objects made by people. And at that point I thought, maybe I could make something like this. And that was the beginning of my crazy idea to make an English version of the Qur'an. Obviously I knew from all the reading and studies I'd done that the most important part of the Qur'an is the calligraphy. So I started thinking, who in America cares most about calligraphy in our times? And immediately I thought of graffiti writers. It's all they do all day is practice lettering, and they argue about letters and get, who does the better letters. So I decided to use a typeface that I was going to invent based on sort of Los Angeles, like Chicano graffiti writing. And I set about. I sat down and I started transcribing the Qur'an in English, slowly, using this font that I had sort of come up with myself. And over time, it took several years. But as I'm going, I'm also reading and I'm listening to the Qur'an recited, and I'm listening to lectures about the Qur'an and reading about it. And actually going places. We got a residency in Paris, and I spent several months at the Institut de Monde Arabe there, looking at more Qur'ans and talking to people, getting in touch with professors and things. But the way that I sort of went about this was I said, I'm not really a religious person myself. And so I said, well, the Qur'an says it's a message for all humanity sent down from God, and I'm a human being, and I live in Los Angeles in the 2000s, and if this message is coming down from God to me, what could that mean to me in my life in the 21st century? And I think it's sort of the same reason that you go to dumpy motel rooms and they have the Bible. There's this, I don't know if it's an American belief, but there's this belief that, someone can be down and out, and there's this, they put the Bible in there and they stumble on it, like some old trucker or something, and they crack it open, and it's the magic of the book reaches them and transforms their life. So I said, well, the Quran can speak to me. What does it mean? What does the message of the Quran mean to me in my life, in my times? And so I took the transcribing, and as I did it, I would try to hope it spoke something to me, or it inspired an image, or if it didn't, I would look further into that particular passage, and hopefully images would come to themselves. But all of the images I meant to come up with were all scenes of life in the United States, as if this message is coming to an American person, and an American going into the world and feeling like, what could this message mean to me? And then when I leave, when I put the book down and go out to the grocery store and the gas station and the ATM machine, how does this affect my life? So I'm assuming you're all sort of familiar with the Quran, but this is a passage dealing with Adam and Eve, and I have it all set as if it's a Hollywood movie set. This is a passage about Noah's Ark, and so it shows a lone person building a boat by himself. Another sort of underlying part of this project was, this was a project I intend to be for Americans that are unfamiliar with the Quran, and I wanted to depict at least a scene from each of the 50 states. So in this instance, I sort of imagined it was like Seattle or Portland or something. This is another passage about Noah's Ark and the flood, and as you know, in the Bible and in the Quran, the depiction of the flood is this horrific flood that wipes out the entire world. Well, that's sort of hard to imagine the entire world being wiped out, but it wasn't hard to remember what New Orleans looked like after Hurricane Katrina. Much of the message of the Quran talks about, restates over and over that remember that this is a message of God. It's coming down to you from the sky. So I have a lot of images of the way that messages are received. This is satellite dishes where messages are received down from the sky. Telephone wires where messages are transferred across our country. Graffiti writers who write messages on trains that then roll across the country and other writers see them. So I have a lot of images about how messages get conveyed. More graffiti writing. This is a newspaper distribution where the papers are printed and then folded and put on the trucks to be sent out. TV chat show, another way that people get together and spread messages across the country. And this is someone removing graffiti, the way that messages are not sent across or nullified or something. I have lots of scenes that have surveillance cameras all around, and the insets are scenes from surveillance cameras in stores and people crossing the street. Another constant reminder in the Quran is that God is watching you all the time. This idea that someone up above is watching you, so you should be well behaved, and think about what you're doing. This is a chapter about the burning bush. There's firemen putting out a tree on fire. There's the bird that it references. So you see, the images are metaphors for what the message of the Qur'an is in each page. And sometimes it's easy to find a direct connection, such as a Noah's flood and an actual flood. But often the message of the Qur'an is more spiritual and vague and internal, and it touches you in different ways. And so it's hard to come up with an image, and so a lot of my imagery is sort of about the mundane parts of life in the United States. You know, where you're reading the Quran, or you're getting messages and then you're putting them down, and then you have to go to the ATM machine. And you're doing these sort of mundane, boring things. But in your head, you're still thinking about that thing that you just read 30 minutes ago and pondering, you know, how can it affect you? This is a whole series about death and life, the sequence of life from old age, from childhood to old age. So I have sort of a nondescript government building, and in this chapter, or in the surah, all the pages show a different civic event happening in the same location. This is a passage, part of the long passage about Moses, and he goes down the river with Al-Kahir, and they go down the boat, and he challenges him to do all these acts. So as you see, the boat is named Al-Kahir. Here's an example of mundaneness. Someone in a cubicle in a boring part of their life, but still, your brain can still be pondering the spiritual aspects of life. I believe this is another passage of the story of Moses from the reed, the baby floats down the river in the reeds. It's a guy cleaning a pool. This is the chapter, the surah of Mary. And I live in the Hispanic neighborhood in LA, which most of LA is a Hispanic neighborhood. But we're in our neighborhood, we have liquor stores with the Virgin Mary painted on the side of them. It goes along with the discussion of Mary's life. Another scene of, another reoccurring message in the Quran is beware, because God sends down catastrophic events to punish people, and also this idea that it frequently says that if you travel around the world, you can see the ruins of societies that have come before us, as a message for you to know that this is a true message. So these are scenes of earthquakes. This is San Francisco. A hurricane in Florida. Catastrophic events. A tornado in the Midwest somewhere. This is I tended to deal with the imagery for each surah, so obviously some surahs are less than a page long, and some of them, I think the longest, surah number 2 is 12 pages long in my adaptation. In this one, it's another surah that talks about the way that you should travel around the world, and you can see the remnants of previous civilizations. So the first page shows a flight boarding to Mexico City, and I don't know if I show the other ones, but through the sequence of this, they end up in Mexico City, and it shows tourists around the pyramids, showing how the Aztecs were the previous civilization that no longer exists. Or in this case, the New Mexico Indian cliff dwellers, which is another society that you see ruins of. Or dinosaurs in the Chicago Museum, things that have come before us that we see relics of that don't exist anymore. And as you can see, I've retained all the borders throughout the book are drawn directly from historic Qur'ans that I saw in the Chester Beatty Library and other places. So I've retained the traditional format of the large borders, the decorations, the palmettes marking the end of each verse, the use of white and gold text to mark the beginning of surahs. Another page about civilizations that have come before us, showing an archaeological dig. It's been so many years since I did this, but I believe this is the story of Jacob, who wanders in the desert. Is that true? He wanders for several times in the desert, then he's imprisoned. So in my depiction, it's two refugees trying to cross the border into the United States in Arizona. And you see the border patrols looking for them, and they're hiding in the cave. And here's more border patrol arresting people wandering in the desert. Divorce. This is, as you might know, the passages that talk about whether women should take the veil, and it's all sort of debated what it means and should they not. But I thought, where in the United States do people wear veils? And I thought, cold, windy days in Chicago. So you see people crossing bridges over the river wearing veils in the snowstorm. I believe this goes along with passages about Judgment Day and being aware that your final judgment will come. To go along with law enforcement images. Passages about that you should always be ready because death can come at any moment, such as in a car accident or in surgery. I don't recall them all. I think this is a poetic passage that mentions the butterflies as being a metaphor for the fleetingness of life. And it shows a really old person in the hospital and a woman who just had a baby, showing the span of life. Using, again, sort of a lot of imagery I stole from looking at Persian painting and Indian painting with the flat perspective, the isometric perspective, the decoratives, and the wonky sort of things. This is the passage that talks about foods that you can eat. And I believe it says you can eat foods that you kill yourself. So it shows people duck hunting. Sort of vague on all the specifics, been several years. Again, about how God sends down the rain lands on the ground, the crops grow, we are provided nourishment from His providing. And then again, I always would think back to myself, well, yeah, God sends the food down, but where do I get my food? I get it at Trader Joe's. I'm a city kid. And, it was a huge project. It ended up taking me 9 years, as I said. I thought it would take me 4 years. It ended up taking me 9 years. It ended up being 240 double-page spreads like these, so you can imagine this is meant to be folded in the middle. And I learned as I went. I think some images are stronger than others, some don't work as well. But this one I think is quite good. This is the legend of the sleepers in the cave, where the 7 people are trapped in the cave, and they come out, and so much time has passed. And it was so great to find a contemporary metaphor. This is it's a Big Bend mine catastrophe in West Virginia that happened about 6 years ago while I was working on this, and these people were trapped in the cave. I believe it was 7 people too. It was such a perfect match of contemporary and the message. So I depicted the same 7 people in the mine, and I think that's when it works the strongest, when New Orleans and Noah's flood are such strong metaphors. This is a passage that talks about warfare and I don't recall, but about warfare and the rules of warfare, how warfare should go on and everything. And so I looked up about the war in Iraq, who most benefited economically from the war in Iraq, and it turned out that Mobil Corporation made the biggest profit off the war in Iraq. This is showing American soldiers in Baghdad. And these are prisoners at Camp X-Ray in Guantanamo Bay, in passages that talk about how prisoners should be treated. This is another scene of Americans. This was, I think, was quite a strong image. It's this poetic passage that talks about the invaders having elephants and their stronger forces, and then the birds fly and drop little pebbles on them. So you see the birds all around the edges, and it shows the Americans coming in with their stronger firepower of tanks and things. This is a poetic passage that talks about a herd of camels, and it's supposed to inspire what it feels like when a herd of camels goes charging past you. And I said, well, I have no idea what a herd of camels feels like, but I know what the roar of like a race cars sound like. It took 9 years. Over the course of the 9 years, I would finish about 50 pages, and then I would have a show of them in my gallery in San Francisco, and then in New York, and then in LA. And then when it was finally finished, it was all brought together into a big exhibition of the entire project, which was shown at the Newport Harbor Museum in Southern California, and then shown in Oregon here, the Jordan Schnitzer Museum. And that's my wife and our that baby. I didn't know she was in that picture. My wife, Elise, is a ceramicist. She's an artist as well. And as I said, so before it was even finished, I had probably had 8 different showings of it in different places around the United States. And every time I showed even portions of the project, I always made sure that we had a mihrab in the gallery to show the direction of Mecca. And so I would ask Elise to build one. And so there she is working on one. And as you know, a mihrab is generally a ceramic thing. It's in the room, it shows you the direction of Mecca. It's always decorated with verses of the Qur'an. And I thought, as I always was to this whole project, well, as an average American, when do we sort of deal with a niche in our lives? So this is the first mihrab that we came up with, and it has verses of the Quran that I found inspiring. Always be just, be true to every promise. Truly with hardship comes ease. But thinking, what niche is Americans familiar with? An ATM machine. So it's in the size and shape of an ATM. Another one that we made for showing in New York. It's decorated with security cameras, as if you're being watched all the time. Another one, to back up, I was speaking with Mohammed earlier, and in general, when I came to this project, I always saw it as that this was a project of a way of me looking at America and looking at Americans and using the Quran as a way to approach America from a different angle. And Americans are so fearful of anything Arabic. They're fearful of just seeing Arabic letters. So I thought, well, what would be the most American text I could put it in Arabic? And so this is actually the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But I figured Americans would just freak out seeing Arabic letters. And when the project was shown in Oregon, they had a budget for us to do a bigger project and asked Elise to do a site-specific design for a mihrab there. And she came up with a massive 14-foot tall mihrab, which was this one with the ATM in the center, but elaborated based on an amazing mihrab that we saw in a museum in Berlin, I think. A quite famous one, but I don't remember the name of that. And around the edges it says, "Whoever saves the life of another surely saves the lives of all humanity." You can see it there. And it was lined up towards the Qibla. Elise also came up with a series of security cameras that were around the galleries. It says Allah on the lens. And the second, I'm always asked, why do I do this? And the second question is, what do people think about it? This is when it was shown in a gallery in New York, and a group of people were just there during prayer hours and used the actual mihrab to find the direction of Mecca. So I think that's what I brought you. It's finished. You can get it anywhere books are sold. It's really cheap. It's an amazing big book. I think it's $62 on Amazon. Tell your friends. And the final question is, people always say, what am I doing now? I finished this project 3 years ago, and I have carried on right now. I've been doing a series of big drawings and prints based on other texts from world history. And it opened last night in San Francisco, and you can see it at Catholic Art Gallery. So that's what I brought for you.
Thank you very much. This was enlightening and inspiring. This is going to be a very informal discussion. Everybody's invited to participate. I might make a couple of comments to start us off and ask a question or two, and then we can all just share in the conversation. I want to start on a personal note. I saw your book about 2 years ago at a friend's house in Los Angeles, and I had a mixed reaction. The first part of the reaction was that it was, I think, a beautifully illuminated piece. It was empathetic. It drew from various sources of art, some elements of classicism that you showed us, and of course themes from contemporary life. And I think it integrates the Quranic verses and messages in very interesting ways with questions of social justice, I think. At least that's what jumped out at me. The part that troubled me is that you stole the title of a book I would have written when I was old. I was going to write